When the undercover black boss walked into his own diner disguised as a regular customer, he carried not just the weight of his business, but the burden of curiosity about what truly happened when he wasn't around. His restaurant had been doing well on paper. Good profits, solid reviews, smiling faces for the camera. But there had been murmurs. A few anonymous complaints, subtle hints of unequal treatment, and a few employee resignations that didn't sit right with him. He decided that to know the truth, he had to see it himself. So, one quiet morning, he swapped his tailored suit for a simple plaid shirt, faded jeans, and a baseball cap. His face, slightly altered with makeup and glasses, made him look like just another man looking for a hearty breakfast on his day off. He entered the diner with quiet confidence, the smell of sizzling bacon and brewed coffee wrapping around him like an old memory. The bell above the door chimed softly as he took a seat at the counter. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a polite but distant smile, slid a menu toward him. Her tone was brisk, practiced, not rude but not warm either. He noticed how she chatted easily with the white customers, laughing, refilling their coffee before they even asked. But when it came to him, she seemed to hesitate. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he knew to observe, not react. He glanced around the diner, watching how each employee interacted with others, how orders were taken, and how the energy subtly shifted depending on who was being served. The walls were lined with framed photos of the boss, of himself, shaking hands with community leaders, smiling with employees, celebrating milestones. But none of those photos could show what he was seeing now, the quiet, invisible line that separated who was served with warmth and who was simply served. He ordered something simple, just toast and coffee. It was the kind of order that took no effort, no stress, no room for excuses. As he placed the order, he noticed the waitress scribble it down quickly, her eyes flickering toward the kitchen where a young cook stood, leaning slightly against the counter. When she passed the order slip to him, there was a whisper, soft but sharp, carried just enough by the silence of the morning for the undercover boss to catch. "Another one of them wanting a handout," the cook muttered under his breath. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. The words froze the air for him. He sat there, his fingers tightening around the edge of the counter, the smile fading from his face. It wasn't anger that hit him first. It was disappointment, a deep ache in his chest that felt older than the diner itself. He'd built this place with pride, believing it stood for fairness, community, and respect. Yet, right there, within the walls he'd helped paint, was a quiet cruelty that had taken root when he wasn't watching. He didn't respond immediately. Years of experience had taught him that emotion clouds judgment. He let the moment linger, observing how easily the others carried on, how no one corrected the cook, how the waitress glanced nervously but said nothing. The silence after that whisper spoke louder than the words themselves. It was the kind of silence that made him realize how discrimination survived. Not always in overt hatred, but in quiet acceptance. His mind began to piece together all the complaints he'd brushed off, the subtle signs he hadn't taken seriously. Maybe that was why certain customers had stopped returning. Maybe that was why some employees, the ones from minority backgrounds, never lasted more than a few months. He had thought he'd created a place where everyone felt welcome. But now he saw that the problem wasn't outside. It was inside, festering behind polite smiles and rehearsed greetings. As he waited for his toast, he watched the staff move about. Every interaction now seemed layered with meaning. When a young black teenager walked in a few minutes later to pick up a takeout order, the waitress hesitated before acknowledging him, her tone slightly curt. The boss's stomach turned. He'd seen enough, but still he didn't reveal himself. He wanted to see how deep this ran, how honest the team would be when they thought no one important was watching. He struck up small talk with another customer beside him, an elderly man who mentioned he'd been coming to this diner for years. "It's a good place," the man said, "as long as you're the right kind of folks." He chuckled like it was a harmless joke, but it wasn't lost on the undercover boss. That offhand remark said more about the culture of his business than any financial report ever could. The toast arrived late, slightly burnt, and without butter. It was a small detail, but symbolic in its own way. He took a bite, his mind no longer on the food. He kept his demeanor calm, but inside his thoughts raced. How long had this gone on? Who else knew? He thought of the younger employees, especially those who looked like him. How many had endured subtle slights? How many had swallowed their pride just to keep their job? His disguise had peeled back the mask of his establishment, revealing a truth he had never expected to find. It wasn't just about bad service or unkind words. It was about a culture that allowed disrespect to go unchecked. He thought about how easy it was for discrimination to survive when the people in charge weren't there to see it. When the waitress finally returned to clear his plate, she asked mechanically if everything was all right. He nodded slowly, keeping his voice steady. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Everything's just fine." But inside, he was making a mental list. Every face, every word, every moment that had unfolded since he'd walked through the door. He realized then that leadership wasn't about just signing paychecks or giving speeches. It was about knowing what happened when you weren't watching, about seeing what people did when they thought they could get away with it. That whisper behind the counter had exposed something far bigger than one employee's prejudice. It had exposed a failure in his own leadership, a gap between what he believed his company stood for and what it had become. The order of toast should have been a simple act, an ordinary exchange between a customer and a server. But inside that small diner, it became the spark that revealed the quiet divisions hiding beneath polite smiles. The undercover boss, sitting unnoticed among his own employees, watched as the hum of breakfast chatter filled the air, the scent of frying eggs mixing with the faint crackle of the radio. From the outside, everything looked perfect, a cozy diner with friendly service and familiar faces. But as he sat there, his disguise in place, he began to see a different reality. The atmosphere was warm, but selectively so. Conversations flowed easily between the staff and certain customers, but when someone of a darker complexion entered, the warmth thinned, replaced by a subtle stiffness that most people might have missed. To him, though, it was unmistakable. He had lived long enough to recognize the look, that flicker of unease, the shift in tone, the way eyes avoided his for just a moment too long. He had built this diner with the dream of creating a space where everyone felt welcome, where good food and respect were served equally to all. It had his name on the wall, his story in the brochures, his values printed on the employee handbook. But watching from behind the mask of anonymity, he realized that paper words meant little without the right people to uphold them. As he stirred his coffee, waiting for the toast he ordered, he saw the waitress laugh with a group of regulars, all white, her energy bright and open. When she turned to take his order, the brightness dimmed. Her smile became smaller, her tone less friendly, as if she were performing courtesy rather than feeling it. He noticed another waiter standing nearby, leaning toward the cook, whispering something that made both of them chuckle quietly before glancing his way. The boss didn't need to hear the words to understand. It wasn't just about him as a man. It was about what he represented. The color of his skin had quietly marked him as someone undeserving of the same easy kindness others received. When the toast finally arrived, the plate was placed before him without the usual smile or casual enjoy. It was just set down, quickly, as if the waitress wanted to move on as fast as possible. He looked at the golden brown slices and wondered how many others had sat at this same counter, feeling the same invisible wall between them and the people serving them. He watched a family at the corner table, a black couple with their young daughter, wait much longer for their food than the tables around them. Their smiles faded as they glanced toward the kitchen again and again, trying to remain patient. The mother's hand rested on her daughter's shoulder as if to keep her calm. The boss's chest tightened as he realized that what was happening to him wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern, one that likely played out daily beneath the surface of cheerful customer service. He sipped his coffee, forcing himself to stay quiet and observe. He knew that in this silence lay the truth. Discrimination wasn't always loud or violent. It often lived in the small choices people made, who they smiled at, who they served first, whose complaints they dismissed. It was in tone, timing, and attitude. It was the unspoken difference between welcome and tolerated. He saw it in the waitress's hesitation, in the way the busboy avoided his eyes, in the smirk that passed between two employees when a young black man walked in to pick up his takeout order. It was casual, practiced, like a habit no one questioned. And that was what disturbed him most, how normal it all seemed to them. There was no overt malice, just a quiet, ingrained bias that ran beneath everything like a current. The undercover boss realized then that this was the kind of prejudice that thrived not because it was taught openly, but because it was never challenged. People learned it through silence, by seeing others act the same way and choosing not to speak up. His heart grew heavy as he remembered the training sessions he'd insisted on when the diner first opened. Sessions about respect and equality that had clearly become routine checkboxes instead of meaningful lessons. Somewhere along the way, the culture he'd tried to build had eroded, replaced by an unspoken hierarchy of who mattered more. The smiles, the service, even the tone of voice, they were all graded quietly by race, and the people enforcing it didn't even realize how wrong it was. As he sat there, he thought about the power of these small actions. A whisper behind the counter could carry more damage than a shout. A look of disdain could wound deeper than open hostility. The people being served, the ones who felt that sting, would rarely complain. They would simply stop coming back, leaving with a quiet disappointment that never made it to the manager's desk. The harm wasn't loud enough to record, but heavy enough to hurt. And now, seeing it unfold firsthand, he understood why his business had been losing certain customers without clear reason. He thought about the reviews that mentioned uncomfortable energy or cold service and realized those were coded messages. Polite ways of describing prejudice. He studied the faces around him, employees he had trusted, people he had hired believing they shared his vision. Some of them probably didn't even think they were doing anything wrong. They might have told themselves it was just their mood, or that they treated everyone the same, unaware of the bias steering their every interaction. It was subtle but powerful, woven into the culture of the place. The boss knew that if he confronted them as himself, they would deny it. They would insist it was all in his imagination, that they never meant harm. That was the challenge with hidden prejudice. It hid behind politeness, behind denial, behind good intentions. He broke a piece of toast and chewed slowly, his mind replaying every small moment since he'd walked in. He realized that change couldn't come from rules alone. It had to come from awareness, from making people see the harm in what they thought was harmless. The environment he had built was meant to nourish people, but now he saw it was feeding something else. A quiet bias that shaped behavior without anyone saying a word. The idea that someone could feel unwelcome in a place he had built with pride was more painful than any insult could be. He thought of his own journey, the barriers he had faced as a black entrepreneur, the pride he had felt opening this diner, the belief that he was contributing to something good. Now, watching this small web of casual discrimination unfold, he realized the battle was far from over. It wasn't just about building a business. It was about building a mindset, and that he now knew was the hardest part. When the undercover boss finally revealed himself, the air in the diner shifted from casual chatter to stunned silence. The same people who had served him indifferently just hours before now stared at him with disbelief, their faces flushing as recognition set in. He stood calmly at the counter, the same seat where he had ordered his toast that morning, the same spot where he had heard the whisper that changed everything. The man they thought was just another black customer now held the power to decide their future. But instead of anger, his voice carried a quiet authority, the kind that made every word heavier than any shout could. He wasn't there to humiliate anyone, but to confront a truth they had all chosen to ignore. The room grew still as he began to speak, not as a boss scolding his employees, but as a man asking them to face themselves. He described exactly what he had seen, how the waitress had treated him differently, how the cook had made that whispered comment, how the other staff had stood by silently, pretending not to hear. He didn't exaggerate, didn't accuse unfairly. He simply held up a mirror. The waitress lowered her gaze, her hands trembling as she wiped the counter that no longer needed wiping. The cook's face turned pale, his bravado gone. He mumbled that it was just a joke, that he hadn't meant anything by it, but the boss didn't let that excuse pass. A joke, he said softly, is only funny when everyone's laughing. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush denial. Everyone in that room felt it, the weight of truth pressing down on their shared guilt. He told them how disappointed he was, not just in their actions, but in the culture that had allowed such behavior to exist unnoticed. He had believed this diner was a place of fairness and dignity, a reflection of his own journey. He reminded them of how he had started this business, from scratch, with nothing but determination and the hope that his success could uplift others. Yet here they were, undoing everything that dreams stood for with small acts of prejudice disguised as normal behavior. He looked at each of them, searching their eyes for understanding, for remorse, for even a flicker of awareness. Some looked away, too ashamed to meet his gaze. Others stared back, defensive, still unwilling to admit they had done anything wrong. He knew that change wouldn't come easily. People rarely saw their own bias until it was dragged into the light. The confrontation wasn't about punishment. He could have fired them on the spot, and part of him wanted to. But he understood that firing them would solve nothing if the mindset stayed the same. He wanted them to understand the harm they had caused, not just to customers but to the very spirit of the diner. He spoke of the countless people who might have walked in, felt unwelcome, and left quietly, carrying that sting with them. He told them how discrimination wasn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it was as small as a cold tone, a delayed service, or a look that said, "You don't belong here." He explained how those tiny acts, multiplied over time, built walls between people and poisoned communities. This diner, he said, was supposed to be a place where everyone could sit, eat, and feel human. If we can't even get that right, what are we really doing? As he spoke, something began to shift in the room. The cook, who had been trying to hide behind his crossed arms, finally looked up. His expression softened, and for the first time he seemed to grasp the impact of what he'd said. The waitress wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking as she apologized, not just for her own behavior, but for being silent when others were wrong. The boss listened, his heart heavy but hopeful. He had seen how easily prejudice took root, but he also knew that people could unlearn it if they were willing to confront it. He decided that instead of firing them, he would make the confrontation itself the first step toward change. Every employee would go through anti-bias training, not the kind filled with lectures and checklists, but something raw and real. Workshops where they would hear the stories of those who had faced discrimination, where they would be forced to see through someone else's eyes. The staff's reactions were mixed. Some were defensive, claiming they didn't mean any harm. Others admitted that they had noticed things but stayed quiet to avoid conflict. That admission hurt the most. Not the prejudice itself, but the silence that let it breathe. He told them that silence in the face of injustice made them complicit. When you stay quiet, he said, you choose a side, whether you realize it or not. The cook nodded slowly, shame written all over his face. The waitress bit her lip, tears spilling onto her apron. The younger employees stood still, their faces pale, realizing how deeply the issue ran. It wasn't about one person's mistake. It was a collective failure of conscience. He didn't raise his voice once, yet every word felt like a lesson carved into their minds. The boss told them that what happened that day wasn't just about a whisper behind the counter. It was about every moment of judgment that had gone unchecked. He reminded them that the people they served were more than customers. They were reflections of the world they lived in, each deserving respect. You don't get to choose who deserves kindness, he said, because kindness isn't a favor. It's the bare minimum of decency. Those words lingered in the air, cutting through the quiet tension like sunlight through a storm cloud. In the following days, the diner changed. The energy was different, quieter but more genuine. The same employees who had looked at him with embarrassment began to treat every customer with new awareness. The waitress made an effort to greet everyone warmly, her smile real this time. The cook took part in every training session, often staying late to talk about what he was learning. He told the boss one evening that he hadn't realized how deeply words could hurt until he imagined being on the receiving end of them. The boss nodded, knowing that true change took time, but feeling a small spark of hope that this was the beginning of something better. He spent more time at the diner after that, not as a boss behind a desk, but as a presence among his staff. He sat at the counter, shared meals with customers, and listened to their experiences. Slowly, the reputation of the diner began to shift. People noticed the difference, not just in service, but in atmosphere. It felt lighter, more human. The same walls that once echoed with quiet prejudice now carried laughter and warmth. The whisper that had once exposed hate had instead sparked transformation. The boss knew that one confrontation couldn't erase generations of bias, but it could start a conversation, and sometimes that was enough to change a culture.